They called him the man who could read battlefields like books, the emperor who bent Europe to his will. But even Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of deception, would one day be deceived himself, not by an army, but by a single spy. It began on a night when thunder rolled over the French encampments, cannons sleeping under canvas, maps scattered across a table lit by flickering lantern light. Napoleon stood over them, his sharp eyes tracing the contours of nations yet to fall. His wars had been won not by numbers, but by knowing what his enemies would do before they even decided to do it. He was, in every sense, his own greatest spy. But someone was watching him, closer than he could ever imagine. Before we dive deeper, tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. I love knowing where our history family is tuning in from. And while you're at it, hit like, share this with someone who loves ancient secrets, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The French Empire stretched like a shadow across Europe. Vienna had fallen. Prussia was broken. Even the mighty Russians had bowed to his campaigns for a time. Every movement of his army, every alliance, every betrayal was calculated down to the last heartbeat. And yet, in this machine of perfect precision, a single hidden gear began to turn the other way. It started with a courier, loyal, trusted, invisible. He carried sealed letters between Napoleon's war council and his generals on the front. But this courier wasn't who he claimed to be. Somewhere along the endless roads of Europe, his loyalty had shifted. His true allegiance lay elsewhere, to a secret network funded by foreign gold and bound by one mission, to make the emperor doubt himself. In the world of war, the sharpest blade isn't the sword, it's information. And whoever controls that, controls victory. The spy's plan was simple, yet devastating. He didn't need to assassinate Napoleon. He didn't need to sabotage armies. He only needed to feed him lies, small, believable, deadly lies. At first, they were harmless. An enemy troop sighted where none existed. A delay in supplies that hadn't happened. A forged order that subtly shifted a unit's position. But over weeks, those false reports began to shape real strategy. Napoleon, the man who trusted only himself, began making decisions based on ghosts. And the worst part? He believed every word. Each night, the spy moved unseen through the camps, blending with officers, speaking just enough to be invisible. He studied Napoleon's habits, the way he spoke, thought, planned. He understood him so well that he could predict the emperor's reactions before Napoleon even voiced them. That was his weapon. As the wars dragged on, the French victories grew costly. Armies that once marched like lightning now stumbled in confusion. The emperor's temper flared. He began accusing his marshals of incompetence, punishing generals who had done nothing wrong. The empire trembled, not under cannon fire, but under the slow poison of doubt. And the spy kept feeding it, one lie at a time. By dawn, the fog of war had thickened, and for the first time, Napoleon was no longer sure if he still commanded his destiny, or if someone else had already rewritten it.
Napoleon had fought 1,000 battles, but none like this. His cannons roared across Europe, his banners flew from Madrid to Moscow, and his soldiers would march through hell if he ordered it. Yet, in the heart of his empire, in the silence between victories, a shadow moved faster than his armies. And that shadow was winning. For weeks, reports had arrived that made no sense. Allies turned against him overnight. Supplies vanished without reason. Enemy troops seemed to know his moves before his generals did. Napoleon didn't believe in luck, only in strategy. But this was chaos wearing the mask of coincidence. He stood inside his tent at dawn, a cup of untouched coffee cooling on the table beside maps soaked in candlelight. His aide-de-camp Berthier waited silently while the emperor read the latest dispatch. Napoleon's eyes narrowed, tracing the ink lines. The message claimed an Austrian division was massing near Linz. Another report said Russian cavalry had breached Prussian borders. Both couldn't be true, and deep down he knew neither was. "Someone," Napoleon muttered, his voice low and sharp as a blade, "is feeding us lies." Far from the emperor's camp, under the cover of night, the spy worked. He had many names, most false. In Vienna, he was Victor. In Warsaw, Emile. In Paris, Le Fantôme. To the network that paid him, he was simply the hand. His job wasn't to kill Napoleon. It was far more dangerous. He was rewriting history in real time. Every forged letter, every intercepted message, every whispered rumor. It was a thread in a vast tapestry of deception. The goal was not to destroy Napoleon's armies outright, but to make the emperor destroy them himself. And slowly, it was working. The spy moved through cities disguised as a traitor, a messenger, sometimes even a French officer. He carried a leather satchel filled with false orders and invisible ink letters. At night, by dim firelight, he would seal new dispatches with forged imperial crests and send them through loyal couriers who never swears they were part of the downfall of France's mightiest man. He didn't need an army. His weapon was confused. Meanwhile, within Napoleon's headquarters, the tension grew unbearable. Every man was a suspect. Every word was questioned. Even Bercher, his most loyal marshal, had begun sleeping in his uniform, unsure if he'd live to see another sunrise. Napoleon summoned his generals to an emergency council. The air inside the tent was thick with suspicion. The emperor's stare burned into each of them. "We have a traitor among us," he said. "Not a soldier, not a marshal. A ghost that whispers into our ranks." Murmurs erupted. Some blamed the Austrians, others the Russians, but Napoleon silenced them with a single gesture. "No foreigner could do this alone," he said. "The enemy moves too precisely. Someone here, someone close, feeds them our plans." He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the tent. "Until we find him, trust no one." Outside, snow began to fall. Europe was turning white, but under that silence, treachery thrived. The spy knew the emperor suspected everyone. That was the beauty of his plan. Paranoia was the deadliest weapon of all. Once a leader began doubting his own men, the army became its own worst enemy. Through the chaos, the spy continued to strike, not with bullets, but with brilliance. One night, he sent a coded letter to a French general stationed in Saxony, posing as Napoleon himself. The order commanded the general to move his troops east, to intercept an advancing Russian division. The division didn't exist, but the movement left the western flank exposed. Within days, British forces stormed across it, capturing vital supply lines. Thousands of French soldiers starved in the cold, and still, Napoleon didn't know who to blame. Weeks later, in Dresden, the emperor finally snapped. "Enough," he told Berthier. "This ghost plays with my empire as if it were a chessboard. I will not be a pawn." He ordered a trap. A false letter would be written, one containing the exact location of a secret weapons convoy bound for Paris. Only 3 people would know its contents. The enemy attacked that convoy, the traitor would be exposed. The bait was set. For days, nothing happened. Napoleon barely slept, pacing his chambers, waiting. Then, on the 7th night, a messenger galloped into camp. His uniform was torn, his face bloodied. The convoy sire, ambushed. In Champagne, Napoleon froze. The enemy had known. His eyes darkened. He turned slowly toward Berthier, the only man who had handled the letter besides him. The silence between them was colder than the snow outside. "Who else saw it?" Napoleon asked. "No one," Berthier whispered. "No one, sire." Napoleon said nothing. He simply turned and stared at the flickering flame of a candle, his mind racing. Somewhere, in the vast machinery of his empire, an invisible hand was still pulling the strings. And he had just learned the worst truth of all. It wasn't an outsider. The betrayal was born inside the empire itself. Far away, in the borderlands of Saxony, the spy watched from a hilltop as smoke from the destroyed convoy curled into the sky. The trap had worked, but in reverse. He smiled faintly, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. He had seen empires rise and fall, but never had he faced a man as dangerous as Napoleon. The emperor would hunt him now, across borders, through nations, into shadows. But that only made the game more thrilling. This wasn't war anymore. It was a duel of minds, and only one could survive. That night, as snow swallowed the land, Napoleon ordered a new decree. All communications, all messengers, all orders, to be hand-carried by men I personally trust. No letter leaves without my seal. It was too late, for the spy was already inside the circle of trust. He wasn't outside the tent. He wasn't in the enemy camp. He was closer, much closer.
The winter of 1813 was a graveyard of empires. The snow didn't just blanket Europe. It buried ambition. Napoleon stood at the edge of a frostbitten ridge near Leipzig, his boots sinking into the white crust, the distant horizon burning with the faint orange of dying villages. His empire, once unstoppable, was bleeding from within. He had faced coalitions, kings, and traitors before, but this was different. He wasn't fighting armies anymore. He was fighting a ghost. Inside his command tent, silence ruled. The fire crackled low, its warmth swallowed by the howling wind outside. Around a long oak table sat the few men Napoleon still trusted: Marshal Berthier, General Savary, and Foch, a former minister of police and a master of espionage himself. The emperor's gaze was cold and unwavering. The enemy knows my movements before my own marshals. My letters are forged before my ink dries. Someone, he said, tapping a finger on the table, is inside my mind, and I intend to return the favor. Foch leaned forward, his face half-shadowed. Then we build a website. Let the spider walk into it. Napoleon nodded slowly. No more armies. No more open battles. From now on, we will fight with silence. That very night, the emperor drafted a new decree, one not meant for generals or politicians, but for ghosts of his own. Hidden within the ranks of his army, he assembled a secret cell of operatives, former thieves, exiled soldiers, disgraced officers who owed him everything. They were men invisible to the official records, less silencio. Their mission, to hunt the hunter. Each man was given false papers, hidden routes, and a singular goal: to trace every letter, every forged seal, every courier route, until they found the invisible hand behind the collapse of Napoleon's empire. But even as his agents spread across Europe, the spy, the same one who had been whispering empires into ruin, already knew, because one of less silencio was his. Weeks passed. The snow thickened. Armies froze in place. From Poland to Prussia, rumors spread that Napoleon had gone mad, speaking to shadows, distrusting his own men. And that was exactly what the spy wanted. Hidden in the basement of a bombed-out tavern in Dresden, the spy unfolded a new set of letters, carefully penned with Napoleon's seal, forged to perfection. Each letter carried a false order, one directing supplies to ghost garrisons, another recalling divisions that didn't exist. Every deception sent a ripple through the empire's heart, weakening it from within. The spy didn't fight for a flag. He fought for something far older, a promise made in the courts of Europe, whispered in secret between rival kings. To destroy Napoleon not on the battlefield, but in history itself. But this time, the emperor was ready. From his headquarters, Napoleon had begun to see a pattern. Every leak, every forged order, every intercepted dispatch, all seemed to pass through a single route: Dresden. And so he made a move no one expected. He left camp under the guise of night. No guards, no entourage, just himself and a single loyal agent from his inner circle, Captain Armand Valois. They rode for 3 days through snow and silence, until they reached the outskirts of the ruined city. The once grand streets were filled with beggars, deserters, and whispers of a war no one believed in anymore. Napoleon wore a thick gray cloak and an officer's cap, his insignia hidden. He looked less like an emperor and more like a ghost himself. "We find the messenger first," he said to Valois, "the one who carries the letters." They spent days moving from tavern to tavern, blending into the cold, hungry crowd. And then, one night, their patience paid off. A man in a French courier's uniform sat at the far corner of a tavern, drinking quietly, a leather satchel beside him. Every few minutes, he checked the door, not for enemies, but for something unseen. Valois' hand drifted toward his pistol, but Napoleon stopped him. "Not yet," he whispered. Instead, they watched as the courier slipped a folded letter to another man, a priest, who nodded and left into the storm. Napoleon stood. Follow the priest. The hunt was on. Through narrow alleys and frozen squares, the emperor followed in silence, his boots crunching softly over the snow. The priest walked quickly, clutching the letter under his robe. When he reached the edge of the old marketplace, he stopped beneath the shattered statue of Augustus, once a symbol of empire, now a monument to ruin. There, another man waited. Napoleon recognized him instantly. The posture, the careful stance, the air of control. It was Fouche's old protégé, Lucien Durac, a man thought dead for months, but Durac was no ghost. He was the spider. Napoleon stepped forward, revealing himself. "Lucien." The man froze, eyes widening in disbelief. "Sire, you shouldn't be here." Napoleon's voice cut through the cold air like steel. "And yet here I am. Tell me, how many letters have you sent in my name? How many men have you betrayed?" Lucien hesitated, just long enough to confirm everything. Valois raised his pistol, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from the shadows. Valois fell, blood staining the snow. Lucien fled into the maze of ruined streets, vanishing like smoke. Napoleon knelt beside his fallen soldier, jaw clenched. The emperor who had commanded millions was now alone in a city that wanted him dead. He picked up Valois' pistol and began to walk, not as a ruler, but as a hunter. Through the blizzard, the chase turned into something primal. Lucien darted through cathedrals reduced to rubble, through burned houses that still smelled of ash and death. But no matter where he turned, the sound of Napoleon's boots followed, relentlessly. Finally, cornered in an old clock tower, Lucien aimed his pistol at the emperor. His hands trembled. "You can't kill an idea," Lucien spat. "Even if you win tonight, the world will remember the tyrant, not the truth." Napoleon's eyes narrowed. "Then let the world remember what happens to traitors." He fired. Lucien collapsed, the echo of the shot swallowed by the storm outside. Napoleon approached the fallen man, kneeling to search his coat. Inside, he found a single parchment, sealed with his own crest. He broke it open. The contents chilled him to the bone. It wasn't a forged order. It was a message, addressed to him. "To the Emperor of the French, when the empire you built begins to crumble, remember this. It wasn't kings or armies that destroyed you. It was trust." The hand? Napoleon stared at the signature, a small crimson mark shaped like a serpent's coil. He whispered to himself, "Then the real game begins." Outside, dawn began to break. The first light glinted off the snow, painting the ruins gold. Napoleon looked toward the horizon, toward Paris, where another battle awaited, not with swords, but with shadows. He had cut one head off the serpent, but the body was still alive. And he now knew that the hand was more than one man. It was an organization, a network, an empire of spies. And its next move would decide the fate of his. That morning, as the emperor mounted his horse and rode into the blinding white of dawn, one thought burned behind his eyes. If a shadow can bring down an empire, then I shall become a shadow myself. The hunter had become the hunted, and now the hunted would strike back. The spring of 1814 brought no rebirth for France. The snow melted only to reveal the bones of an empire, its roads broken, its towns scarred, its people exhausted by years of war. Napoleon sat alone in Fontainebleau, the silence of the palace pressing against him like a weight. Gone were the thunder of drums and the cheers of soldiers. Only the faint echo of his footsteps remained. Outside, the world was closing in. The Allies had crossed the borders. Paris had fallen. But in the emperor's mind, one battle still raged, not against kings or generals, but against the hand, the invisible power that had guided every betrayal, every whisper, every fall. And in his heart, he knew, the war was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the shadows. Days turned into nights, sleepless and haunting. The emperor's once sharp mind refused to rest. Every sealed letter, every messenger's footstep, every flicker of a candle seemed to hide another betrayal. Marshal Berthier had fled. Ney was missing. Even Fauch, the master of deception himself, had disappeared into the folds of history. But one thing remained, a trail. A final piece of the puzzle left by Lucien's dying hand, a mark shaped like a serpent's coil, carved into the back of the forged letter. Napoleon had seen that symbol once before, long before Dresden, before Leipzig, in a secret dossier from his early campaigns in Italy. It had belonged to a covert organization, known only by whispers, les ombres de l'empire, the shadows of empire. They had existed for centuries, long before the Revolution, serving whoever paid them in gold or power. Kings, popes, even rival generals had once used them to rewrite history. Now they had turned their venom on him. "Then let us finish this," Napoleon muttered to himself, rising from his desk. He summoned one of the last men still loyal to him, Colonel Etienne Gerard, a decorated soldier known for his cunning as much as his sword. "Colonel," Napoleon said quietly, "we have one enemy left. Not a nation, not a man. A hand that has pulled the strings of my downfall." Gerard frowned. "Sire, the war is over." "The army." "The war is not over," Napoleon interrupted, eyes cold. "Not while ghosts still whisper my death." He unrolled an old map across the table. A red circle marked a region deep in the Jura Mountains, near the Swiss border, an abandoned monastery. "This," Napoleon said, tapping the map, "is where it began, and where it will end." The journey was secret. Only 3 men went with him, Gerard, a trusted courier, and a silent tracker from the Imperial Gendarmerie. They rode through forests and snow-melt rivers, avoiding patrols, passing villages where no one recognized their emperor anymore. The monastery stood at the edge of a cliff, swallowed by mist and ivy. Its bells had not rung in a century. As they entered the crumbling hall, the smell of damp stone and burned wax filled the air. Candles flickered along the walls, recently lit, proof that someone was there. From the shadows, a voice emerged, calm, controlled, familiar. "Welcome, Emperor." Napoleon turned, and there stood Joseph Fauch, the man who had once served as his minister of police, his spy master, and his shadow. For a long moment, the 2 men said nothing. Only the distant sound of dripping water echoed through the hall. "Of course it's you," Napoleon said finally. "Who else could weave such a web?" Fauch smiled faintly, hands clasped behind his back. "Sire, I didn't create the web. I simply made sure you stayed caught in it." "Why?" Napoleon demanded. "After all I gave you, power, status, you gave me fear," Fauch interrupted softly. "A world built on conquest cannot last. The kings you dethroned, the nations you humiliated, they needed balance. I offered them that balance, order through chaos. You betrayed France," Napoleon hissed. "No," Fauch said, stepping closer. "I saved it from you. Napoleon's hand drifted toward his pistol, but Fouch raised his palm calmly. "Shoot me if you wish, sire. But the hand will still move. It is not mine alone." He motioned toward the far end of the hall, and out of the shadows stepped 5 figures, each cloaked in gray. Their faces were hidden, their presence almost spectral. "These," Fouch said, "are the hand, the rulers of rulers. You called yourself emperor of men, but they are emperors of history." One of the hooded figures stepped forward, their voice a whisper that carried through the stone chamber. "Empires are not destroyed by armies, Bonaparte. They are undone by time, and by men like us who know how to bend it." Napoleon's voice was steady. "Then time will remember this moment as the one where the hand was broken." With a motion quicker than breath, he drew his pistol and fired, not at Fouch, but at the candles along the wall. The flames exploded, plunging the chamber into chaos. Gerard and the soldiers stormed in, blades drawn, clashing with the shadows. The flicker of swords, the crash of footsteps, the echo of gunfire, the monastery became a battlefield. Napoleon moved through the smoke, eyes locked on Fouch, who fled toward the inner cloister. They met again beneath a massive stained glass window depicting St. Michael defeating the serpent. Irony not lost on either man. "Do you see, Fouch?" Napoleon shouted over the roar of fire. "Even your saints are tired of serpents." Fouch raised his weapon, but Napoleon was faster. The two struggled, the pistol clattering to the floor. "Do you think this ends with me?" Fouch rasped, choking as Napoleon pressed him against the wall. "The hand exists because men like you make it necessary." Napoleon's grip tightened. "Then I'll burn your world of whispers to ash." With one final surge, he drove Fouch backward through the stained glass. The window shattered, and the spymaster fell into the abyss below, his scream lost in the wind. Silence returned to the monastery, broken only by the crackle of flames. Gerard limped toward the emperor, his uniform torn. "It's done," he said. "They're gone." Napoleon nodded slowly, staring at the shattered window. For a moment, he almost believed it, that the shadows had finally been destroyed. But then, from the debris, he noticed a parchment pinned to the altar, sealed with the serpent's mark. He opened it. "You may kill a man, you may silence a name, but you can never destroy the idea that built the hand, because that idea was yours." Napoleon's hand trembled slightly as he read the words. He looked down at the seal, realizing for the first time what it truly represented. The serpent devours its own tail, the empire consuming itself. By the time they rode back toward Fontainebleau, the news had already reached him. Paris had surrendered. His marshals had turned. The game was over. When the Allied envoys arrived days later, demanding his abdication, Napoleon signed the document without hesitation. His face was calm, his hand steady. But in his mind, the words of the letter burned. "You can never destroy the idea that built the hand, because that idea was yours." He understood then. The spy's war had never been about nations or revenge. It had been about showing him the truth, that even the greatest empire, when built on fear and ambition, would eventually become its own shadow. On his final night before exile, Napoleon stood on the balcony of Fontainebleau. The rain fell softly, washing over the courtyard where thousands had once cheered his name. He spoke quietly to Gerard, who stood beside him. "Do you know why I lost, Colonel?" Gerard hesitated. "Because the world feared you, sire?" Napoleon smiled faintly. "No, because the world learned from me." He turned his gaze toward the dark horizon, where the thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. "Empires are not conquered," he said. "They are imitated, until they destroy themselves." As dawn broke, Napoleon left Fontainebleau to begin his exile on Elba. The crowds were silent. The once great emperor rode through them like a ghost. And somewhere, in a candlelit chamber deep within Europe, unseen hands continued to write letters, forge seals, and shape the course of nations, just as they always had. Because though the man was gone, the shadow remained. And history would forever remember not the armies, not the crowns, not the glory, but the invisible war fought behind every empire's rise and fall. The hand never dies, whispered the legend. It merely changes who it serves.